Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 253 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 28 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. So welcome back, everyone. Glad you're still with me after the break. Season 13 of the show continues today with episode 253, and I thought we'd take a break from the actual play for a while and get back to some of our other topics and things that we discuss on the show. So I hope that you've all been enjoying the actual play, been spending a lot of time getting those produced and out to you. So I hope you all are enjoying the campaign. Some big things have happened recently. I don't want to spoil anything for those of you that haven't checked it out yet or aren't completely caught up. But the last few sessions, some things have finally come about that have been going on in the background since the very beginning of the campaign. We've been playing for about a year and a half now, I think. So there have been some things going on behind the scenes, some things about the player characters themselves that the players didn't know, the audience didn't know, nobody knew but me and I guess my wife. And so that was a long time to keep all of that under wraps. So it was really rewarding for me as a GM to be able to reveal those things in the last few sessions. So that's been a lot of fun. Seeing how the players react to these surprises I'm throwing their way. And just a lot of fun. And, you know, it's kind of interesting because normally the advice I would give to you as a fellow GM is if you have a really cool idea, don't fall into the trap of planning this long, elaborate setup for your idea where your cool thing that you have the idea for that you want to do is way in the future. You know, you're like, oh, you know, I have this awesome idea of something I want to do, but it's for high level player characters and my player characters are low level. So, you know, in 6 months, I'll be able to do this cool thing I came up with. Whenever possible, I would advise GMs to use that cool idea now or tomorrow, as opposed to putting it off for 6 months or building it up for 6 months or longer. Just because so many times things come up and 6 months later, you're not playing anymore for whatever reason. And I know that's happened to me in the past more times than I can count, where I have these cool plans in the game that I'm running that never come to fruition just because we stopped playing for some reason. Or another thing that can happen is you keep playing, but the campaign goes in a very different direction than you were anticipating. And now that cool idea you had, you can't really use anymore because you're going in a completely different direction. So normally I would advise, hey, if you have this great idea that you're really excited for, use it as soon as possible. Don't put it off. However, this is one example of me not following that advice that actually worked out where, you know, I had, without spoiling anything, one of the big things is there's something about the player characters that was a secret that the players didn't know. Nobody knew but me and my wife. And, you know, I knew from the very beginning of the campaign that was something I didn't want to reveal for a while. I didn't want to reveal it in the very beginning of the campaign. I didn't want to reveal it when the player characters were low level. I wanted to wait until they'd had some adventures, had some experience, grown in power somewhat, both like personal power and also just their influence politically and whatnot. So, you know, I planned this long con as they call it. And, you know, I knew all along that it was a risk because the reason I give the advice I just gave to you is because so many times in the past I've had really awesome plans that I never got to play out for whatever reason. So I knew there was a risk of that happening, but I decided to go for it anyway, and it worked out. We kept playing. We've had some significant breaks here and there for various reasons, but we've kept the campaign going, and we finally got to the place to do those reveals. And I will say, keeping the advice I gave just in mind, I will say, kind of on the flip side, that when you do the long con, the payoff is better. It's kind of like the anticipation thing. The more you anticipate something, sometimes the more you enjoy it when you finally get that thing that you've been wanting. And it's definitely true in this instance, at least for me, it was true that I feel like I really enjoyed doing those reveals a lot more, partly because I'd been waiting so long than I would have if I'd done the reveal, a month or two into the campaign. So, like any advice I or anyone else give about GMing, there's always the caveat of, it depends on you as a GM, your style, what you like. It depends on your players, what they like. And it depends on the specific situation you're in and all those things. So it's really hard to give blanket advice of you should always do this or you should never do that, because it is so very situational. And sometimes doing the quote wrong thing, like for instance, waiting to do a reveal for a year and a half, turns out to work really well. Of course, sometimes it doesn't. So, we're all kind of making it up as we go. I feel like no matter how long you GM, that's the case. I mean, I've been GMing for over 28 years and I still am winging it most of the time. As far as, I'm always trying new things and trying different ways of doing things. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And if you watch or listen to my actual play, I'm sure you'll see plenty of examples of both of things that worked great and things that didn't work so well. So as I said, season 13 of the show is continuing. As far as what I'm planning for the rest of season 13, there is more actual play in the pipeline. Let's see, I've released up through session 21 on the show so far. The campaign is still going strong. We're playing actually session 24 here in a couple weeks. So I've got a couple sessions recorded that I haven't been able to produce an actual play yet. But I do have the audio version in the podcast up through session 21. And I've recently resumed uploading the video versions of the actual play to YouTube. So just this weekend, I uploaded sessions 15 and 16. So quite a bit behind the audio version. And that's mainly just because it takes a lot more time to produce the video version. And I will say that the video version is not super edited. It's more of kind of a live stream experience. I don't go through it and edit it with a fine-tooth comb like I do with the audio version. So, if you're interested in, especially if you're interested in better audio quality, because there's much better audio quality in the audio version, then just stick to listening to it on the podcast. But if you're a more visual person, or you want more of a kind of live experience with all the warts and all of not being edited a lot, you can check out the video version on my YouTube channel. So as far as other things in season 13 that I'm planning in addition to actual play, my next episode, episode 254, is going to be my review of Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which is an adventure or a series of adventure that's been put out for D&D 5th edition. It's the 5th edition version of Undermountain. So I'll be talking about that next week. I also just got my review copy of Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is the newest supplement for D&D coming out. And in fact, as of recording this, it's not actually out yet. So super cool that I got it early. So I'll be talking about that on the show as well in a future episode. And I still have the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica yet to talk about as well. I'm also going to continue my deep dive into the Dungeon Master's Guide. I know a lot of you really enjoy those episodes. And next up in that series is going to be discussion of downtime activities, which I'm really looking forward to. Downtime activities is something I've always kind of done in D&D, but this is the first time, at least that I recall, seeing it really codified in the game books themselves as far as describing various things characters can do during downtime and what the effects of those would be. Also, I feel like downtime can be used a little bit more extensively than how I always did it in the past, which in the past, before downtime was really a thing in the game per se, I would just occasionally in a campaign have months or sometimes even years of downtime, basically between adventures. And I did that partly just to make it seem a little more realistic, the power growth of the characters by having more time go by than what we're actually playing through. Let the characters age a little bit and also let them pursue things other than adventuring, especially if I had spellcasters who wanted to research spells or create magic items or things like that. I didn't so much have downtime during an actual adventure, though, which is an idea that's presented in 5th edition that was kind of new to me. I'd never even really considered doing that. But I enjoy the downtime. I think it can really add a lot to your game. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. And finally, there's always room for discussions on other topics that are topics that you're interested in that maybe I haven't thought of. So if you have any RPG or GM related questions or topics you'd like to hear about, let me know. You can shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Also, if you have a gaming story you'd like to share with me and the listeners, perhaps something that happened at your table recently that taught you a valuable lesson, that would be an excellent thing to send my way that I can pass on to the other listener GMs, and we can all learn with you from your valuable experiences. Because, at the end of the day, I'm just one person. And, I've had a lot of experience as a GM, but in all fairness, most of that experience was in the murky past. So it's always easiest to talk about things that are most recent as far as things that have happened and things that you've learned or thought about, as opposed to trying to talk about something you learned 20 years ago. So yeah, there's kind of a limit to my experience and things I think of to talk about. So I'm sure there are gaps in what I've covered on this show, questions I haven't answered or ideas I haven't discussed. So, if something like that occurs to you, or like I said, if something happens in your game that you learn something from or gives you a new perspective and you think that would be valuable to other people, let me know and I'd be happy to talk about it on the show. So just a few announcements and things that I want to let you know about as far as Game Master's Journey and gaming and all that good stuff. Want to just let you know, in case you've noticed in recent episodes a change in the kind of the sound of the audio. Hopefully not a change in the quality of the audio, but if you notice the audio seems a little different lately, that's because I am using new software to produce the show. Some of you may know that I used to use Adobe Audition, and I'm a big fan of Audition as far as a program to use. It's a great program to use. It's fairly easy to use once you learn it. I find it, at least for my workflow, how I produce podcasts and audio for videos, it's efficient for me to use. I can do things I feel fairly quickly on it. Compared to other software I've used in the past. Like I started out using Audacity, which really the only good thing I can say about Audacity is it's free. It's really, I hated that program. And since I went to Audition, I've tried to go back to Audacity a few times and I just can't do it. It's just, I just can't stand that program. But the huge downside with Audition, and it is a downside that continually grows, is you can't actually buy Audition. You can't own Audition. You have to rent it. It's part of Creative Cloud, which you have to pay every month forever to use. And, for years I've been using Audition. I've been paying every month to use it. And it just, especially with things that have been going on economically for me lately in the last year, it just, I couldn't justify that cost anymore. And especially when there's software out there that's just as good, if not better, that I can own and buy once and be done with it. So I've started using Reaper, which you can try out for free, which is nice. And then to buy it, it's like $60. It's not even that much for a program that you actually buy and own. And you don't have to pay every month. You pay $60 and you own it. I mean, I pay more than $60 in 3 months of using Audition. The other great thing about Reaper is, unlike Audition, Reaper is a full-fledged DAW or digital audio workstation, which means in addition to producing podcasts with it, I can actually produce music with it, which is something I'm getting into. So that's really exciting. But I'm still learning to use the program, and it is a different program. So some things I'm doing differently now just because I'm using a different program. So if you notice a change, that's it. That's why. Hopefully the quality still is good. If you don't think it's as good, definitely let me know, especially if you can be specific about what you feel is not as good. Because I am still learning the program and how to use all the various plugins and whatnot. So still dialing in the sound to where I want it. But I've been happy with it so far. Let's see. Got a few new patrons that have joined us that I want to thank on the show today. So huge thank you to Cody E and Captain Jellico. Thank you so much for joining the patrons and supporting Game Master's Journey. Really appreciate it. Also got a new iTunes review recently from Tony Danza Extravaganza from here in the US, who says, I really like the read-throughs of the Player's Handbook and the DMG. I think we care about different things. I care about campaign building instead of world building, but overall it has a lot of useful advice. If you are new or less new to DMing, I'd say check it out. So thank you, Tony, for your review. I really appreciate it. All right, so as far as the rest of the episode today, I have a few topics I want to discuss today, or a couple topics, I guess. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my initiative system that I've started using for D&D. I did an extensive blog post on it recently and got some feedback from a listener GM who saw some ways that system could be possibly abused. So I've heard from a couple other listener GMs that had similar thoughts. So I have some thoughts about that and how to address that if you're using this system and you have players trying to abuse it. I have ways to stop them in their tracks. And then finally, I just have some feedback I want to share with you, and going to talk a little bit about tailoring your game, whatever game you're playing or running, to your particular group of players, to what they want, which is always, I think, best for everybody at the table. But we'll talk about that further on in the show. So recently on my blog, which you can find at starwalkerstudios.com/blog, I made a post about my initiative system that I use for D&D. And to be clear, I'm not redoing the initiative system. Initiative still works the way it works in D&D. I'm not changing the rules of initiative. I've just changed just kind of the logistics of how I handle initiative rolls at the table. It started out as kind of an experiment. I love experiments. And I just had this idea of a way I could maybe streamline initiative and make it so it doesn't take up so much time at the table to deal with initiative, and also to avoid initiative disrupting the flow of the game, and especially disrupting dramatic tension that I'm trying to build in a scene that's going to involve some combat or might require an initiative roll for some other reason. So I'll have a link to that post in the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. If you want to check that out, highly recommend you check that out because I explain how it works in detail, but I'll just nutshell it here for you now, just to refresh your memory before we talk about some feedback I got on that and some additions to that system if you need them. So really, there's not much to it. It's really simple. So usually in a D&D game or in other games that use similar initiative systems, you're setting up your scene. Let's say you're in a dungeon, player characters enter a room, you describe the room. Maybe there are some NPCs in the room, and maybe these NPCs are not necessarily hostile to the player characters, but could be hostile. It all depends on what happens, how the player characters talk to them, how the players role play with them, what they choose to do. So imagine this kind of setup, right? So the player characters come into the room, they meet the NPCs, they start to have a dialogue. Now, normally just for role playing, you're not going to use initiative. So you're just kind of, role playing with, the players and these NPCs, and things turn violent. This just happened in one of the recent actual plays I uploaded where the player characters were speaking with this witch. And at first they were having a conversation, but then things were said and it turned to violence. So normally what would happen at that moment is you have to stop everything and say, roll for initiative, right? You see this in actual plays all the time. We're building up this awesome scene and we're role playing, and then someone decides they've had enough and they want to attack someone, and everything grinds to a halt and everybody rolls initiative, figures out their bonuses. The GM rolls initiative for all the NPCs, and then everybody tells the GM their initiative numbers, and the GM establishes the turn order. And I don't care how awesome you and your group are, how super efficient you are, that takes time. And that's time that your tension that you build up in the scene is evaporating away. That's time that the players have to get distracted or start looking at their phones or start looking up the new spells they're going to take when they level up or whatever. And you lose momentum. Even if it doesn't completely destroy your momentum, you're going to lose some momentum. And I found in every game I've run, every group I've run for, this happens. And you can see it in actual play all the time. Any actual play you watch that does it this way, just watch when they get into a combat in time, how long it takes them to establish the initiative. Time the amount of time from when the first person says, I attack, to the time when they start resolving attacks because they've dealt with initiative, and minutes go by. Minutes when you, the watcher, are bored. Minutes when the players are probably bored. The only person not bored is the GM because the GM's frantically trying to establish the initiative order. So I was looking for a way to make that better. And I hit on this idea of, well, there's no reason that you have to roll initiative at that time. And in fact, when you think about it, that seems like the worst time to roll initiative. So basically what I do now is when I start the game session, I have player characters I run online. So as they log in, or, when player characters get there and we start the game in person, at the very beginning, before we even start doing anything else, I have everybody roll initiative and I record those numbers. I have also, as part of my prep for the session, already rolled initiative for any NPCs or monsters or whatever that I'm going to have in the first encounter, or what I think will be the first encounter. I already have that done before the players even get there. Then when the players get there, I have them roll initiative. And then while they're role playing with one another, deciding what they're going to do in the background, I'm establishing the turn order for the first encounter. Maybe I don't know what the first encounter is going to be. So in that case, I just have the player character's initiative recorded. And then as things go, most likely I'm going to know what the first encounter is at some point before it actually happens, right? Because I'm going to see what's coming next. And so as soon as I realize what the first encounter is going to be, then I can establish my turn order and roll for my NPCs while my players are doing whatever. I mean, it does require a little bit of doing two things at once, but that's part of being a GM, right? You're constantly doing things behind the screen while you're also listening to what the players are saying and what they're doing. So then when we get in that situation where they're having the conversation and it turns to combat or just combat starts, we just boom, we're in combat and I know who has the first turn and it's like, okay, player X, it's your turn. What do you want to do? Or, okay, you guys attack. Okay, well, this NPC wins initiative and goes first and here's what they do. And we just boom, we're seamlessly into combat. There's absolutely no pause whatsoever. And we go into it. And then we do the encounter. And then after the encounter is over, usually after the player characters have found any treasure there is defined and they're writing down on their sheets what their treasure is and all that stuff, or maybe casting healing spells on one another or whatever, the recovery phase of an encounter. At that time, I ask the players to roll initiative again, and I save those numbers for the next encounter and then just rinse and repeat. Now, there's a couple different ways you can handle it as far as, that last encounter and you have them roll for the next encounter and then the next encounter never happens because the game session is over. If you want, you can save those numbers for the next week and use that for the first encounter. Or what I do is I just throw those numbers out and then we start over the next week. But that's up to you. So that's really simply how it works. And again, if you want more explanation of the nitty gritty of all that, feel free to check out the blog post for more information. So listener GM Martin, who I'm pretty sure is the same Martin, the anthropologist who was on the show in the past. And a lot of you really loved that episode, and so did I. That was a great discussion. But anyway, Martin commented on my blog post and he had some really good thoughts. He said, "Hey, Lex, you talked about your initiative system a few times now, and I always wanted to write to you about that. I think that there is a possible downside. Not many groups use this, but there are ways to influence your initiative. Things like inspiration or the lucky ability, and there are probably other things as well. So you could argue that the player characters can still use these things to influence their initiative, but some of those features should be used before you know the result of the initiative roll. For example, with the assassination rogue, this could be a real tactical decision, but not so much if he already knows that his initiative for the next encounter will be 18, 19, or 20. So I think here what Martin's referring to is the assassinate ability that a rogue gets at 3rd level, which says you have advantage on attack rolls against any creature that hasn't taken a turn into combat yet. So I think what Martin's saying here is if a player knows, if a player who's playing a rogue knows before a combat even starts that they have a really high initiative roll, like a 20 or something, and they're an assassin, that might influence their tactics because they know, hey, if I initiate a combat right now, I'm most likely going to get to go first because I know I have an initiative of 20, which means I'm going to be able to use my assassinate ability. So that is a possible instance where that player, knowing that initiative number ahead of time because you rolled it at the beginning of the session or you rolled it at the end of the last encounter, could give them an unfair advantage or might influence their decision-making in some way. So Martin says, could you add these considerations to your system? Do you know other things that can influence initiative on the spot that you might not know if you let players roll a few hours before the encounter? So basically, are there other ways that this could be abused by players, essentially? So I think that's a really good point. And honestly, I hadn't even thought of that when I wrote the blog article or in all the times I've used this initiative system or came up with it. Honestly, for me in my games, this has never come up, partly perhaps because I haven't had anyone playing an assassin rogue. And, I looked for other instances where, initiative matters and whether or not the players know what initiative is before an encounter starts matters. And I honestly had a hard time finding many instances. So these are pretty corner cases or niche cases, I think, where this would come up. And it just has never come up for me in my game. So that's why I never really thought about it. But since Martin asked about it and some other people mentioned this, I did think about it a bit. I mean, there are definitely, some ways that initiative comes into play or can be manipulated by player characters or players. And there are definitely, some what I would consider edge cases where them knowing what their initiative is ahead of time might give them an unfair advantage. So, one caveat I should give as far as how I personally run 5th edition D&D is I do not require players to declare that they're using inspiration before they roll. So technically, by the rules, you have to declare that you're using inspiration before you make your roll. And I don't do that. I let them use inspiration after they roll the D20, but before I tell them if it's a success or a failure. And just the reason for that is I've had it happen before I started doing it this way, where a player says, I'm going to use my inspiration because this is an important roll I'm making, and they're using 2 different colored D20, so they know which is the D20 they normally roll and which is their quote inspiration die. And they roll their dice and they roll like a natural 20 on the regular D20, not the inspiration die. So in that situation, the player's like, oh, I just completely wasted my inspiration because I would have rolled a 20 without it. And I just felt like that was a feel bad moment for the whole table, honestly, because inspiration is a reward often for good role playing or good ideas or just things that you think the player did that was awesome. And so to give them this reward and then have the reward end up to mean nothing, or the player feels like they just wasted that reward and like they made a mistake, when in reality they didn't make a mistake. There's no way they could have known what the dice were going to come up. I just didn't like that. And I found a very simple fix to that was to say, hey, you don't need to tell me you're using inspiration before you roll the D20. So you can roll that 20-sided, you can see what number you get, and then you can say, hey, you know what? I rolled a 4. I'm going to use my inspiration and add another D20 and take the better of the two. As long as you do that before I tell you, for instance, if it's an attack, before I tell you if it hit or miss, I'm fine with that. So because of that, this is less of an issue because inspiration doesn't matter as far as the way I do initiative. Now, if you do inspiration by the book, then that could come into play because you can use inspiration on an initiative roll. So, that might get, you might have some possible issues with that if you require them to declare declare they're using inspiration before they roll. So I just want to give that caveat because that's a possible issue that could happen that I haven't run into just because of the way I personally use inspiration. So let's say you have some situation that for whatever reason, you're worried about your particular players gaming this system, abusing this system. You want to use initiative the way I do it and streamline gameplay. And I guess I forgot to mention, obviously it still takes time to roll initiative and make your turn order and all that. It doesn't really reduce the amount of time it takes. Well, I think it does actually a little bit, but not a lot. So this isn't really about reducing the amount of time initiative takes, but what it's about is taking that time and instead of having it at the very beginning of an encounter, that's usually a tense encounter, which is the worst time to deal with that kind of thing, instead putting it to either the beginning of the game session or the end of an encounter, which is a less tense time. And there's usually some bookkeeping and stuff going on then anyway. So it's less of a disruption to the flow of the game and to an encounter that you're wanting to run to do it that way. And also as a GM, you can handle your end of the initiative in the turn order at any time you want. You don't have to do it at the beginning of the encounter. So that's the upside of it. So, let's say you want to use this system, but maybe you just have players that will abuse anything they can, or maybe you have an assassin rogue and you're worried, about the interaction with that, or maybe the player characters have some spell or feat or ability that you think is going to be messed up in some way if they know ahead of time what their initiative is and what the turn order is going to be, at least of the player characters. So here are some ways that you can deal with that and still use my initiative system and still get the benefits of it. So I think an easy solution is simply instead of having the player characters roll initiative once at the beginning of the session or at the end of an encounter, have them roll a few times, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, however many times you want, and record those in sets. So for instance, at the beginning of your session, say everybody roll initiative, record those numbers as initiative set 1, and then say, okay, everybody roll initiative again, record those numbers as initiative set 2, have them roll again, initiative set 3, have them roll again, initiative set 4. Now you have 4 sets of turn orders for the player characters that have been established. And you can just choose which one you want to use for a given encounter, or since you have 4, you could roll a D4. So now the player characters know maybe what their initiatives are, but they don't know which of those sets you're going to use. So they don't necessarily know for a given encounter who's going to go first, who's going to go second, etc., unless they happen to derive the exact same turn order for all those sets. But you could just keep having them roll sets until you see some variation, and then maybe discard some of the ones that are the same. I mean, there's so many ways you could handle this, right? So I think that's a really easy way to handle it. And then you can just use those initiative sets for the entire session. So in a way, it might even be better because then you don't have to roll at the end of encounters. You can just handle all the initiative rolls at the beginning of the session when people are kind of getting settled in and the game hasn't started anyway. And again, if you have them roll a number of sets that are equal to one of the dice in the game, then you can use that die to determine randomly which of that set you're going to use for a given encounter. So you could have them roll 4 sets and roll a D4, or have them roll 6 sets and roll a D6, have them roll 8 sets and roll a D8, that kind of thing. This is also something, if you play online, you could even handle this outside of the game session in some way. If you use a chat or Discord or something where you have a dice roller, or you just trust your players to be honest about what they roll, you can get these initiative numbers days before the game if you want. Now, of course, you only need to roll for the NPCs and your, things you're controlling once. You don't need to do 4 or 6 or 8 initiative sets for your characters, just for the players. Now, honestly, I don't think a lot of times this is going to be necessary, even if you have an assassin rogue. I found in my experience, my players don't remember what they rolled for initiative. I think the only way they know or remember is if they wrote it down. So maybe if you have a player playing an assassin rogue and it's the kind of player that is going to cheat or try to find loopholes or abuse things as much as they can, that player might sit and write down everybody's initiative numbers so they know. But if you have that player at your table, you probably know, or you'll find out pretty quick. And then you can use my solution here to deal with that player and make it random so they don't know who's going to go first. So, I think at this point, it's a good thing to point out kind of one of my core philosophies as a GM, which is I don't go looking for trouble. I don't sit there and look for ways that the players can abuse things. Now, if I should caveat, I'm talking about just in general planning for sessions, running the game, things like that. Now, I'm not talking about homebrewing systems. So if I'm going to homebrew a new spell or a new magic item, then yes, I'm thinking about how that could be abused and whether or not that's a problem. But as far as just using the game, published official material of the game, just running the game day to day, if I have a player who rolls up an assassin rogue, I'm not sitting there thinking of all the ways that player might try to screw me or try to cheat at the game and coming up with solutions for all those ahead of time. I give my players the benefit of the doubt. I assume they're going to play nice and they're not going to try to cheat or get an unfair advantage. I assume they're going to do their best to keep player knowledge and character knowledge separate. I assume they're going to do their best to metagame and that if metagaming is happening, that all I'll have to do is just make them aware and say, hey guys, I think you're metagaming a little too much, and that'll be the end of it. And in my games, those assumptions are all correct because, well, I'm playing now with players I've played with for a long time, and I know my players, and I frankly don't play with players who cheat or who try to abuse the game or try to gain unfair advantages or try to have more fun themselves at the expense of the fun of the other players or me, the GM. I just don't play with those people. I'll either kick them out of the group, or when the campaign's over, I won't invite them back. So, part of this might be curating your players that you play with. But that's how I handle it. As a rule, I don't go looking for trouble. I don't try to anticipate how players might, abuse things. Instead, if or when I see abuse happening, I deal with it then. Now, I will say that maybe part of the reason I'm comfortable doing that is because I have so much experience as a GM. I'm confident in my ability to deal with those kinds of things on the fly, and I've dealt with them in the past, so I kind of know how to deal with them. So if you're a newer GM, and you have an assassin rogue, maybe you do want to think about, I think the player might abuse this ability, and if they do, how will I respond to that? So, you may have a different approach, but that's just kind of my philosophy. So yeah, that's kind of my response to that. And again, this comment that Martin made is a comment on the blog post, and I wrote a response in the comments of the blog post that's pretty extensive and goes into more detail than this, so you can check that out. But since then, I've gone through the books and I've tried to think of other ways that this initiative system could be abused, and I haven't really found any. So, I think there's a possibility with the assassin rogue, with the assassinate ability of abuse. There's potentially a possibility with using inspiration for abuse if you do it by the book. However, if you do it the way I do it and you don't require inspiration use to be declared before the D20 is rolled, then that problem kind of goes away. So yeah, two kind of edge cases that I've found, and that's really it. So yeah, I think for those few instances, or if you just have players that, abuse everything they can, and you want to keep playing with those players for some reason, just do the initiative sets and choose them from those, and your players will never know what the initiative order is before the encounter starts, just like if you do initiative the usual way. All right, so I have some more feedback that I'd like to discuss on the show today. And, I love getting feedback because it leads to me often talking about things that I wouldn't have talked about otherwise. And I very much want this show to be what you need it to be as a new GM, or just any GM who's looking to improve their craft. So, keep the feedback coming. It really helps everybody, I think. So Lucas sent me an email and said, "Hi, Lex. I'm a relatively new GM from Germany." Hey, Lucas. Great to have another listener in Germany. And I was looking for tips and guidance on YouTube when I found your video on preparing and running a West Marches style game. Wow, that's going way back in the Wayback Machine. That's awesome. This and some of your following Game Master's Journey videos, as well as the behind the screen stuff, has been really helpful and informative to me. I sincerely thank you for taking the time and energy to produce your videos. You're very welcome, Lucas. So this is someone, sounds like mainly getting my content on YouTube. So yeah, that's awesome. And for those of you that don't know, the behind the screen is a series of videos and podcast episodes I did talking about my current D&D campaign, Hinterlands of Elandria / Blood of the Avatars, from, behind the screen, from the GM's perspective, talking about the nuts and bolts of creating and running the campaign. I would love to do more of those episodes. However, in the last few of them I did, I kind of gave a call out to you to ask questions and give me guidance on what you want to hear about. And I haven't heard from anyone. So until I do, I feel like I've kind of said what I have to say about it. So If you want more behind the screens episodes, then send me some questions or comments on some of the game sessions, preferably the more recent ones, but any of them really. All right. So Lucas goes on to say, over the last year, I tried to get my friends, my group of friends to play D&D and other RPGs. But while we had fun, it never really felt like the game worked for my particular group of friends. An RP heavy game that I tried running at the beginning didn't work. My expectations and those of my players weren't aligned. It was much more entertaining for them to go through dungeons and have combat encounters. I tried using the basic random encounter tables in the DMG, but that was a total failure for us since everything felt mostly unconnected and I felt very unprepared. That and the notion that I should have a rotating player pool for a West Marches game made me not want to put in the time to create a world where West Marches could work. Eventually, we just didn't meet to play D&D anymore. Yeah, that's really unfortunate. I really hate hearing stories about that. And yeah, that's an unfortunate thing that happens, I think, more often than any of us would like or maybe even want to admit, where there's just not an alignment of, all the players at the table and the GM at the table as far as what everybody wants, because there's so many different game experiences you can have. I just started running D&D here locally, here in Bellingham, for a small group of players. They're all, for the most part, they're all brand new to D&D, brand new to role-playing games. And, one of the things I thought about when I decided to start running for these people is, what game do I want to run? I was just talking with my wife about it the other day, and, and another game other than D&D that I could have run is one of the Star Wars games by Fantasy Flight Games, which there are things I love about those games. There are things I hate about those games. But I think something we can all agree on is they're a lot different than D&D as far as the mechanics and how they're played, and even the experience at the table, and even the goal of the game itself. They're very different. And, I don't think the Star Wars games are good games to start out with. I think if I threw that game at these players, they'd be lost. They wouldn't know what to do, because it's not like D&D where you roll dice and you get a number and then that number tells you what happens. It's much more open to interpretation because you're getting symbols, not numbers, and you have to interpret those symbols. And to ask that of a brand new player, brand new to RPGs, I don't think is going to go well for most groups. Definitely not for this group that I'm running. So when thinking about these particular players and what would work, that game was out, even though I think otherwise they would enjoy a Star Wars game. So I decided to go with D&D because I think it's a relatively easy game to learn. I think it's a relatively easy game to teach. I also think it's a game that you can just learn on the fly. The players can sit down with pre-generated characters and not know the first thing about playing the game, and we can just start playing. We can just start doing an adventure, and I can explain the game as we go. They don't need to do homework or figure things out beforehand. So that's what I decided to go with, just because I think it's a good game to start with. Also, D&D is pretty present in the culture now. Most people have some familiarity with it. And even if they don't, they have some familiarity with a lot of things that inspired D&D or were inspired by D&D. Things like The Lord of the Rings, which inspired D&D, World of Warcraft, which was inspired by D&D, The Witcher, which was inspired by D&D, or countless other video games that were inspired by D&D in some way. So there's less of a bar to entry in that way, in that most people have some concept of a fantasy world like Middle Earth. So they can wrap their heads around the fantasy aspect of D&D, and I'm a knight, or I'm a wizard, or I'm a rogue, or whatever. Or if they play something like World of Warcraft or whatever. So that was part of it too. But, it's completely possible that D&D isn't really the right game for these guys, because one thing about D&D is it's it grew out of a war game. So it's very concerned with combat. I mean, if you're going to run a game with no combat, I mean, it'd be kind of stupid to run D&D because, the vast majority of the mechanics of the game are geared around combat. So why would you use that game if you want to have a no combat game? There are much better games out there for that. So D&D is very focused on combat. It's very focused on tactics and strategy and, optimizing how you play your character and using the best ability at the best time and that kind of thing, which for certain groups, that's exactly what they want. But maybe these players turn out not to really care about that stuff and they find it boring. My wife was talking about how long combat takes. And I was kind of like, well, you think combat takes a long time at first level, wait till you're 10th level. But anyway, maybe they don't like that. Maybe they think that's boring. Maybe they're much more interested in role playing or political stuff or things like that. And in which case I would run a different game for them. Or maybe they don't care for fantasy and they'd rather do something science fiction. So I think a big part of this is finding the right game. And, the right game may change based on the particular players at your table or even, the mood that you're all in, what you're in the mood for. Sometimes you just want a beer and pretzels game. And, D&D is a perfect game for that because you can just have a beer and pretzels game with, just hack and slash and just have a good fun, tell some jokes. And, if you're going to do that kind of thing, D&D's probably a good game for that, as opposed to, again, Star Wars, where, you'd have to put so much more time into making your character and stuff. It seemed like you're putting a lot into this, beer and pretzels game. So yeah, I feel like that's a big part of it is finding the right game. And another big part of it is knowing what everybody wants, being able to communicate as a group and know what every player at the table wants as far as what kind of an experience they want and making sure that those are aligned. Because if you have one player at the table who wants nothing but combat and wants a lot of crunch and systems optimization and that kind of thing, and then you have another character or a player at the table that hates that and never wants to see that, and they just want to role play, it's going to be really hard running a game that's going to satisfy both those players all the time. You might be better off running two different games for two different groups, and those two players can be in two different groups. So yeah, part of it's finding the right game and part of it's finding a group of players whose goals align with one another and with what you, the GM, want to do. So Lucas goes on to say, I feel like your videos gave me so much insight into random/flexible encounters and how I could run for my group in particular. Again, thank you very much for sharing your opinions and experience. And yeah, thanks for that, Lucas. I'm glad it's been helpful to you. And yeah, that's a great point. I did some videos /podcasts on flexible encounters, which is kind of what I do instead of random encounters. And I also, again, did an extensive blog series on that. So if you want to know more about flexible encounters, check out my blog. So if you're someone who does not like random encounters, or there are things about random encounters you don't like, check out my flexible encounters. It might be just what you're looking for. Also got an email from Marcelo who says, hello there. This Friday, I was clearing all the podcasts that I don't listen to anymore, but I realized that I just couldn't delete yours. Well, that's great to hear, Marcelo. Always good to hear that people are still subscribed. Don't get me wrong. I have several reasons for not listening to a podcast. I don't listen to many gaming podcasts, and I don't even play D&D. And yet your podcast stands out. Thank you very much. That's awesome. Marcelo says, I never write to an author nor make donations. I'm the worst kind of listener I know. No, that's okay. Not everybody does that. That's fine. What you can do though is tell your friends about the show. Honestly, that's the best thing you can do. Even better than writing in. Let's see. But I just felt the urge to say this. Kudos. I don't know how, but your podcast captures my attention. I love the in-depth review of different D&D books with your comments alongside. I really like your honesty about your struggles to keep the show running. I also like how you speak of old school gaming without being bitter to new games and play styles. Your podcast works for me and is still on my phone. I wish you the best in 2019. So thank you so much, Marcelo. I really appreciate that. And honestly, that means a lot to me to hear from someone who doesn't even play D&D, but they still listen to the show because they enjoy it. That's great, because I really hope that this show is useful to people other than just D&D players. Also, Marcelo says he's from Chile. So I have a Chilean listener as well, which is awesome. So thank you so much for your email, Marcelo. Got an email from Sam who says, "Hey, mate, been listening to your podcast and particularly enjoying the episodes on the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. I've only played D&D 2 or 3 times before and have recently DM'd my first game." Good for you, Sam. That's awesome, man. You're just jumping in like I did way back. A lot of people feel they need to play for a long time before they're ready, quote, ready to DM. And I don't think that's true. And it's great that you just jumped into it, man. Awesome. Your podcast was a big part of my campaign and session preparation. Awesome. I just listened to episode 207 in which you were having a tough time and wanted to send my encouragement. I'm also looking forward to listening to your actual play episodes. Thanks for all your help in the content you're creating. Kind regards, Sam. So thank you so much, Sam. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad that this show has helped you with your campaign and session prep. I think that's really important. And I think in this day and age, it's something that some people at least think that they can skip on and it'll be okay. And I mean, for some people, maybe it is, but I think for most of us, you need to do some prep and you'll thank yourself and your players will thank you for it later. But you want to be smart about how you do your prep and not waste a bunch of time. So I think it's a really important thing to talk about. And so I'm glad that that's been helpful to people. Oh, that reminds me, I wanted to comment on something Marcelo said, about being a old school gamer without being bitter to the new games. And yeah, I'm glad you feel that way. I'd like to think that's true. I am pretty old school. I started gaming in the late 80s, early 90s, I think it was. I think it was early 90s, which, I mean, back then we wouldn't have called that old school. We'd say you're old school if you started in the 70s. But these days it's pretty old school. A lot of the popular games didn't exist back then other than D&D. So yeah, I guess in that way I'm an old school GM, and there are things about old school gaming that I like and I hold on to. There's a lot of it that I don't like. I'm not a big, for instance, I'm not a big OSR person, old school Renaissance or whatever that stands for. These people that think like the golden age of D&D was in the 70s or the 80s and they just want to play D&D like it was back then. I mean, nothing against that. If that's you, everybody is free to, have their own likes and dislikes. But me personally, I think the game has improved a lot since the original D&D, and I would not want to play it in its old form. I remember when I was at Gen Con, I played an OSR game and I hated it. I had fun with the game session, with the adventure that the GM ran, even though it was kind of a meat grinder, I'm going to kill you all kind of thing, which normally I don't like. But it was, it's 2 a.m. We've all had a few drinks and we're just going to have fun with this kind of thing. So it was a lot of fun. But as far as the system, I hated it. I don't like rolling for ability scores. I don't like rolling for hit points. I don't like races being classes. I mean, there's just so many things about the old way of playing D&D that I don't like, and I would never want to go back to that. I think the game has improved immensely since then. I think second edition was an improvement of first edition. I think third edition was an improvement of second edition. Fourth edition, they lost sight of what they were doing and I hated it. But then fifth edition was an improvement over third edition and definitely improvement over fourth edition. So I think the game continues to improve, but I don't think that old school gaming is terrible across the board. I think there are good things about it that I think are important and that I value. For instance, tracking ammunition, I like that. I definitely feel like there's a point in a campaign, and it's not that high level where it doesn't matter anymore. And for your own sanity, just forget about it, other than magical ammunition. But for the first few levels, yeah, track ammunition. That 1 or 2 gold you got to pay to spend to buy some more arrows matters at first, second, or third level. How many arrows you have matters. If you run out of arrows in a dungeon, which I've seen happen before, it matters. Once you've got high level spells and stuff, it stops mattering and it's just annoying. So don't do it. But in the early stages of the game, I think it's really important. And a lot of newer games would not track ammunition or would use some other way to do it that's more, quick and dirty, and we're not literally counting how many arrows do you have. Another example of kind of an old school thing that I still enjoy is Encumbrance. Now, this isn't something I do in every game session. I don't sit down and itemize every player character and how many ounces of weight they're carrying, but it is something that I will use on occasion. And it's something that I use only when I feel that they're getting beyond what they could realistically carry. And I'm very grateful that we have a system to figure out how much you can really carry. And it's not like a video game where you have this ridiculous amount of stuff in your inventory that you could never realistically carry around, and yet somehow you are. So Encumbrance is something, again, more useful in lower levels. Once the player characters have bags of holding, it kind of doesn't matter anymore, other than some niche instances where, maybe they find a huge marble statue that's worth a lot of money that they want to take, but, it won't fit in the bag of holding or whatever. Or they find so much gold that it won't fit in the bag of holding, that kind of thing. And I enjoy that. Part of original D&D was logistics. That was part of the game. Again, it grew out of a war game, and a big part of a war game is logistics. Which is to say, for instance, you just killed a dragon and there's all this treasure, but how are you going to get it back to town? How are you going to get the treasure out of the dungeon and back to town when there's all this treasure and it's more than you can carry and you can't get a wagon into the dungeon to load it up? What are you going to do? Again, when you're dealing with high level characters, it's not a big deal. They can teleport. They've, got, bags of holding and portable holes and all that stuff. But in the beginning of the game, low levels, that kind of thing is important and can be fun to creatively find solutions to. And that's always my guiding light for this stuff is it fun, right? If tracking ammunition adds some fun to the game or adds some surprises that lead to fun, then I think it's worth doing. If it's just bookkeeping and paperwork and annoying and doesn't add anything, then it's not worth doing. And I think that is more of a new school outlook, not so much an old school outlook. So that's an example of ways that, gaming has improved since back in the day. But, there were good things back there that we want to hold on to. So thank you again to all the listener GMs who sent me feedback. Really appreciate it. And again, if you have a question or a topic you'd like me to discuss, please shoot me an email, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 253 of Game Master's Journey. Stay tuned for next week when I'll be discussing Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. And if you'd like to get a hold of me and suggest a future topic or ask a question or just give feedback on the show, I'd love to hear from you. And there are lots of ways you can get in touch with me. Shoot me an email, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker. I have a voicemail. You can call and leave a message, and I might even play your message on the show. That number is 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. And it's just voicemail. No one's going to answer the phone. So I know I could definitely see having anxiety about calling and, oh God, what if Lex answers and I have to talk to him? It's just a voicemail number. There's zero chance that a real person will answer the phone. So all you're going to do is talk to my voicemail. So no worries there. You can also join our community on MeWe and Discord, and you can find links to those in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey. Finally, if you enjoy Game Masters Journey and you'd like to help support the show, I've got quite a few ways you can do that. You can check those out at starwalkerstudios.com/support or follow the link in the bottom of the show notes. Probably the best way you can support what I'm doing is to check out one of my self-published D&D supplements, Relics of Power or the Trickster's Labyrinth. And which reminds me, Relics of Power, I'm currently working on an update to that. So most people I heard from about Relics of Power really enjoyed it. But one criticism that I did hear a few times were that the relics from my Hinterlands of Elandria campaign didn't go all the way up. They only went up to like 5th level or something. And the reason for that was that's all I developed them up to that point, because that's where we were in the campaign. And my original thought was that I was going to periodically update Relics of Power and as, the player character's level, and gradually, flesh those out and add higher levels to those relics, which, by the way, a relic is a type of magic item I've created where the power of the item scales with the level of the player character using it. So that's in essence what they are. So I am updating Relics of Power, and the Hinterlands of Elandria relics, I have advanced them all the way up to, I believe, 17th level. So they're pretty much done. I'm reserving the right and the possibility in the future of coming up with maybe some kind of level 20 like capstone ability for them. But as to this point, I have all the things they get all the way up to level 17. It's all written, it's all done, it's all edited. We're just laying it out right now. And kind of in the same vein of what I talked about at the beginning of the show with my audio editing software. Same thing with doing layout for the supplements. We used to use Adobe InDesign. Same kind of thing. You can rent it, but never buy it. So we've recently switched to, I believe it's called Affinity Publisher. And my wife is doing the layout. And so she's having to learn new software to do this. And it's basically meant where before we could have just done an edit and been done. She's basically having to start from scratch and do the whole layout over because it's new software and you can't just import from one to the other. So it's taking quite a bit longer than we thought, but we are still working on it, and that will be coming out sometime relatively soon. I'm also going to learn to do it myself, so that we can both work on it. So yeah, there will be an update to Relics of Power coming soon. I'm also working on some new supplements. One I'm working on is a series of GM guidebooks on just GMing in general, GMing for D&D specifically, and also world building. So I'm working on those, and also working on sort of a Primordia Player's Guide, which is just going to be a collection of things that I've homebrewed for Primordia, things like backgrounds, spells, trying to think what else, magic items, more mundane equipment, new cleric domains, things like that. So player character options and things for player characters. So I'm working on that. I've got quite a bit of homebrewed stuff, and coming up with more. So those two things will be coming out sometime in the future as well. So you can find all that stuff on my website, starwalkerstudios.com. And thank you to everyone who's purchased my D&D supplements. And for those of you who have purchased Relics of Power, you will get the update. So when we finish version 2.0 or whatever it's going to end up being, everyone who has purchased it, including if you purchased it as part of the bundle with the Trickster's Labyrinth, which is an adventure I created, you will get the update. You'll get a link where you can download the new version. I will warn you, probably once we upload the new version and we get that finished, probably the price is going to go up a bit just because we had to put so much more time and work into doing the update. So if you buy it now before we finish the new version, you can get it for the current price and then you will get the update for free. But once we're done with the update, I'm probably going to raise the price of that a little bit. So yeah, I guess, if you're listening to this and the new version isn't out yet, you can get in now, and save a little money. All right. So that's it for episode 253. Hope you enjoyed the show again, or today again. Hopefully you've enjoyed it before. If not, if you're new, welcome to Game Master's Journey. And got more episodes coming down the pipeline. So stay tuned for more. I hope in the meantime that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG, and I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.